Good afternoon. Welcome to MEED Live. My name is Richard Thompson. I am the Editorial Director of MEED. Today we've got a very special edition of MEED Live. We're going to be looking at the finance, and particularly the private finance, of power projects and power infrastructure across the Middle East and North Africa region. So Rajit, I want to start with you. Can you just summarise briefly what it is that we're seeing in terms of the shift towards public or private finance, the types of contracts being used, why it's happening and what it means?
A couple of reasons. First and foremost is the efficiency and the effectiveness of actually delivering a reliable service to the people here. Power and water, which are the essentials of life. Once you bring in the IPP, the private sector model, you bring in good efficiency and are able to deliver this very important reliable service. The second important point here, again to be contextualized, is the fact that the IPP model is basically using private sector capital in order to fund large infrastructure projects. And by corollary, what you are doing is you are preserving the capital of the state in order to use it for the most essential, like the transmission, like the last mile distribution, wires and poles, the networks, the water distribution networks, and therefore you are able to conserve the capital, or at least you are able to make sure that the fiscal deficit that many of these countries are going through for the last 4 or 5 years, again in the context of oil prices, the sharp dip in the oil prices and so on and so forth, all of that is very well managed.
Okay, so it's, in short, it's a more efficient way for governments to procure infrastructure. Yes. Do you think if it wasn't for, say, the downturn in oil prices or the fiscal pressure, would governments prefer to retain ownership in a perfect world?
I think it's still going to be an evolution. The market was going to go to IPPs eventually, even if it wasn't to budget constraints, and even if it wasn't, because some governments look at IPPs as a means for attracting foreign direct investments. Maybe this is one of the aims of some of the governments, is to attract foreign direct investments for infrastructure projects. But another important reason for the trend of IPPs is really shifting or mitigating some of the risks from the utility and the government to a private developer. Such risks as technology risks. When you want to introduce a new technology to the country and you're not aware of the technology, you would rather shift the technology risk to a developer, because the developer will look into the technology more. The execution risk. Another reason why IPPs is growing is shifting the execution risk to a developer, as well as the O&M, operation and maintenance, long-term operation and maintenance, service contract. So you're really mitigating a lot or shifting a lot of the risk from a utility or a government perspective to a private sector developer. A good example, a live example of this is a project that we developed in UAE. It's one of the pioneer projects in UAE in Sharjah with Siwa, where it started from really a concept, identifying the pain point that the customer had, and working together with the customer on providing the solution, the value story. And the value story started with availability of funding. What type of funding in the market is available? What type of developer do you need to bring in to make the value proposition competitive to the developer? Efficiency was key, making sure that you're producing power efficiently. Reliability was extremely important. The competitiveness of the tariff, which in turn is financing and the IRRs for the project, and the funding availability and choosing the right funding structure, whether from debt to equity. So Siwa was a classical example where you really leverage the availability of funding pockets, and it gives you really an example of financing being a driver in a value proposition story than rather an enabler, because it's an integral part of the competitiveness of the offering. So it's efficiency, it's really the technology, it's project execution, it's reliability, and it's financing. So financing really now is an integral part of the full value story and the mix.
From a bank financing point of view, you'd much rather lend to Saudi Arabia or the UAE than you would to Iraq or Egypt, I presume.
Well,
Yes and no, because ultimately, as Ahmed was mentioning, each country has its own dynamics and its own risks. Ultimately, what lenders look for is, yes, mitigating, political and commercial risk or project risk, given the term of the financing, right? And typically, IPPs can be, 12 years plus, basically. I think the other important factor here is enforcement and dispute resolution. Does the country have the environment to be able to allow lenders to enforce should things start to go south? So I think that's a critical element. Comparing an environment like Saudi to, let's say, Egypt or Iraq, again, it's more like apples and oranges. Have projects in the power sector been financed successfully in Iraq? Absolutely. And for long tenors. I mean, we're not talking short tenors here. Egypt historically has been one of the largest users of ECF financing out of any of the countries in the MENA region. Another country which has again benefited from different modes of financing, both IPP as well as private sector, has been Pakistan. I mean, this was the poster child, the hub power project done back in the 90s was the poster child for the World Bank, basically, in terms of how an IPP should be done.